It's my great good fortune and pleasure this morning to be able to introduce our keynote speaker. Miyashiro has been helping teams and groups think together in front of each other in new ways for more than 27 years. From Fortune 100 companies to small nonprofit associations, her clients report greater productivity, increased personal meaning, and more human connections. The strategic planning framework she developed, called Integrated Clarity, was first introduced in 2007 in a business book called The Change Handbook, the definitive resource on today's best methods for engaging whole systems. Editors called her work an exciting contribution to the field. Just recently, in October 2011, her first book, The Empathy Factor, Your Competitive Advantage for Personal, Team, and Business Success, was published by Puddle Dancer Press. A former publisher of Fortune magazine says about the empathy factor, and I quote, "Breakthrough thinking from cover to cover that will lead to more meaningful discourse and heightened impact." Born and raised in Honolulu, Hawaii, Marie joins us from her home base in Tucson, Arizona, where she enjoys nature on a regular basis through hiking and rock climbing. Join me in welcoming our keynote speaker this morning, Miyashiro.
Good morning. I'm waiting for the mic to come on. I am happy to be here with you, and I'm really humbled to be here with you. I arrived a full day early yesterday morning so that I could meet and talk with some of you. And I think I've had conversations now with about 50 of you because I wanted to ask you what you think is important about partnerships. Having heard your awards, I'm thinking I could probably be your student. And I think you know a lot about being friends and partners and building relationships. So I'm imagining that what I have to share with you today will reinforce and maybe confirm some things you already know and also add some new thinking to you. I want to start by sharing a story with you on, well, I'll tell you a funny story. I think that last night, I never give the same talk twice. Why? Because every audience is different. And everything I say is speaking, what we call speaking into the listening of what's present. And this is something that you probably already know with all your relationships. This is an important concept in what I'm going to share with you today is what people say is informed by how someone is listening. The very next way you listen to someone could change the way they think, the way they respond to you. They're thinking about things. Some of the best work we do with teams all occurs in the form of questions. Our job as consultants and facilitators is to be coaching listeners, to think of questions that help you get to places that you might not have ever thought of before. So I've got a couple of stories. One is last night, because of this idea of me taking in what I learned from a group of people yesterday at this convention, I was going through this slide presentation and kind of moving things around, and I was getting a little frustrated because I have so much to share, and I'm so passionate about this work. I've been doing this work for almost 30 years now. And in fact, I'm kind of at that age, you know, where I was meeting with an executive director last year, and she said to me, you're so easy to talk to, thank you so much. And I thought, oh, this is just wonderful to hear. And then she said, you're like a second mother to me. And I thought, I'm not old enough to be her mother. And then I started doing the math. And I thought, oh my gosh, I am old enough to be her mother. I would have been a very young mother. I just want to make that clear. So my entire career working in, I worked early on in my career in New York City and Honolulu in two of the largest communications firms in the world. So I've had that training, and then very shortly after that I went out on my own because I saw that there was an absence of something. And the absence I saw in business and in nonprofits is this idea that somehow the work is more important than the relationships. That somehow the work was more important than the people. And I have good news for you. I'm celebrating with you because since the publication of this book in October, and since the time that I've been doing this work, what I'm learning and seeing is that this idea to empathize with people is on the cutting edge of what will be the most sought after, I think, training of Fortune 100 companies, which we work with. We're already seeing it there, nonprofits and partnerships. It's a word that really hasn't been used very much. I was talking to a gentleman over here earlier, and he said, I'm really looking forward to hearing you speak. I'm curious. And I said, why? And he said, well, because it's not a topic that I really hear people talk about, empathy. So I want to tell you that when I was writing this book, it took me 6 years to write this book. 5 of those years I did no writing at all. 5 of these years I was wondering, how am I going to say what I think is important in this book? And one of the main things we struggled with is what to call it. What would the title of the book be? Our publisher and I really struggled with this. And the reason is because some people told us, if you put empathy on the cover, people aren't going to buy it. They're going to think it's soft, that it's not practical, that it's not real. Men won't buy it. So I really thought about this, and I said, at one point we were going to call it something else. And then finally I said, well, look, this work is about empathizing. This work is about people. And if part of our mission is to help people normalize this word as a workplace skill, then let's put it on the cover. And we did. And I'm happy to report with you, this is kind of like a party. You've been invited to our party here because we're celebrating, because the book is going to be translated into Dutch, into, I believe, French or German. I can't remember which one. But it came out in October, and it's already getting, a lot of attention in different places that I never thought it would. And the reason why I'm happy to share this with you is because what it tells me is that the stuff that you know how to do, empathize with volunteers, people who visit your recreation centers, how to create collaboration between your boards and the government agency. This idea of really connecting as human beings is now becoming legitimately accepted. And you're going to see this word, I believe, more and more often in the years to come. So I want to say that I'm really happy I picked this title, The Empathy Factor. Last night, so getting back to that story, I was in the room moving something around and thinking, how can I share this with you? The reason I care so much about what you do is because I overheard a number of conversations yesterday, and I heard how passionate you are about what you do, promoting, preserving public lands. And I want to thank you for what you do, because I'm the beneficiary of that. I rock climb, hike. I grew up surfing in Hawaii, although that's not a public land, it's public water. But it's all related to the idea of something that's what in your video is called the heart and soul of America. So I'm very humbled by what you do, and I hope that some of what I have to say to you can contribute to what you do immediately as you go through the convention and as you leave this room, when you go back to your places and your homes. So in January, I worked with a Fortune 100 company, and I want to share with you some of the results people are getting when they actually learn how to empathize with others and also empathize with yourself. This is a key concept that a lot of people miss about empathy that I want to correct up front, and I'm going to talk about it a little more. But empathy is actually a two-way street. It's about empathic listening, yes, and we know this because that's how we usually define empathy, listening to others. And in this process, I'm going to share with you, I will share with you a very particular process that I have found works better than anything else I've seen. I've been in this field, my degree is in communication, for over 30 years now, and I have never seen anything like this work the way it does. It can work immediately for you, and it's based in the work of a man named Marshall Rosenberg, who developed a process called nonviolent communication. I'm curious how many of you have heard of nonviolent communication? Okay, so only a few of you. So I'm happy that I can contribute to you in this way. And the idea here is really about how to create more connection. So we worked with this Fortune 100 team, and they experience many of the stresses that probably your organizations have. We were called in because they had 2 separations, what they call them. So already 2 series of being downsized. So they were doing twice the work with 1/3 the staff. How many of you are experiencing anything like that? Okay, so the other thing is, this group used to be autonomous. They used to be very self-contained. They didn't really have to talk to very many people. They did their own thing. Now they were being asked to collaborate with 6 new groups. How many of you are experiencing anything like that? Okay, so that's the other factor. The third factor that we're all experiencing is that technology, communication, resources, competition, it's all creating this huge pressure of change. Okay, change is happening all around us in nearly every industry at a very accelerated rate. So I want to reassure you, you're not crazy, that you're overworked, maybe under-resourced, maybe wondering how to keep up with what's going on. It's happening everywhere. It's the nature of what happens in our work today. And I'll tell you a secret that came up when I was talking to Sue yesterday, who's the executive director of the Grand Canyon Association, which is my home state. I was telling her, just as a matter of conversation, that one of the reasons why empathy is so powerful is because the head is a logical mechanism. And the head is very sequential, and it waits for all the pieces with logic to fall into place. So that's a good thing. But consequently, it tends to be slow. You know, you have to, by the time you think of something, the world might have changed around you. Okay? The heart, on the other hand, you know, the opening of the heart, this idea in business that you might call trust and engagement, that's how heart manifests in workplaces and in organizations, in your nonprofits. The heart is very fast. It works like lightning. You know, you can be with somebody and in a moment create something new together because you had a heart connection. This is one of the huge advantages of creating a web. One of your award recipients or presenters called it a web of organizations. This is one of the key reasons why you want to have in your web a lot of trust and engagement. Because then when something happens, you can make a change and you're all still integrated and you're all together. This is one of the key reasons why we're being asked to work with a lot of Fortune 100 teams now, because they have to change at a very rapid pace. And there isn't time to go into the room and map out a whole chart. So I'm going to talk to you a little bit about that. I have some good news, and this is the great news, is that we were all born to partner. It's natural to us. We're genetically encoded that way. Our brains work that way. We're social beings. It's part of who we are. So I like to think of this process not so much as learning something new, but instead of remembering something that's already natural to us. When I first met Marshall Rosenberg in Atlanta about 8 years ago, I sat there and I had the most astonishing thing happen to me. I had already been doing the work we do for 19 years. And in my field, the first 10 years, you're sort of just ramping up and getting good at it. Because working with organizations and people in them, or what we call multi-stakeholder groups, what a lot of you do, bringing a lot of different people together for a shared purpose, it's very complicated. You know, it's not like going home and having a conversation with your kids or your partner. There's all kinds of other factors involved in it that I'm going to share with you. And so the first 10 years, I was really, you know, getting very fluent in my work and developing my practice. And then the next 10 years, you know, you really start to hit your stride and you're thinking you're doing great and you see the results you're producing. And now, you know, the following 10 years, now that I'm 30 years into it, and when I met Marshall Rosenberg, I started to realize that some things I fundamentally believed were just flat out wrong. You know, so it takes you 30 years to get to a place where you realize that some of the things you were doing were just a little off. And that's why when I met him, I started to see that a lot of the questions I had that were unresolved and how to work with teams and organizations could really be resolved with this simple process. This process I'm going to show you takes 5 minutes to learn and a lifetime to perfect. And I'll share that with you, why that is. So we were born to do this. So partnerships. If there's one thing we've learned about partnerships in the last 30 years in my field, which is organizational dynamics and group dynamics, it's this key concept, the idea of inclusion. Inclusion, including people and who to include. This is a key idea. Including the people who do the work, who implement the work, has proven to be significantly a variable of creating greater results and productivity. Not a little bit of productivity, much greater productivity. So the whole purpose of leadership now, with this concept, is really about learning how to make people feel included. Understanding how to create approaches that generate inclusive solutions. And I was telling this to a CEO of a mid-sized business once, and he was listening to what I said, and he looked at me and he said, "You have time for all that?" You know, because it takes time to include people. You know, it really does. But it is an investment with a huge return. I'm sure you already do a lot of this. If you already do some of it, I want to encourage you to do more. If you already do a lot of it, I want to encourage you to do more. You know, when we do strategic planning, for example, those of you who are on boards of directors, we never do strategic planning with boards of directors anymore. Why is that? Because it does not meet this principle of inclusion. It doesn't involve the people who are doing the work. So when we do strategic planning, half the success, I think, that we have is that we have the right mix of people. So we have volunteers. We have the people who are line staff. We have people who are also on the board. And I like to have at least 50-50. And we're working with a group in the Midwest now, and I'll go to visit them next week and work with a team of about 22 people. And the CEO was doing a launch call. So these are calls we have with the group before we get to being in the room together. And he said, you know, we've had 3 or 4 strategic planning sessions that really didn't work out well in the last few years. And he said, I think the reason is because we had the wrong mix of people. We were doing it at the board level. And he said, you know, when I think about it, this makes sense to me because the board thinks about our organization about 12 times a year. You know, when they're getting ready for a board meeting or leaving a board meeting. Whereas the volunteers and the people on the line staff are thinking about it every day. And if I'm guessing right, you're probably thinking about it at night and wake up in the night and when you're sleeping and when you're having breakfast. So this is a really important idea. I was sharing this idea with someone on our team the other day, and she said, it's so common sense. I said, yes, it's common sense. But you would be amazed at how many people do not do it on simple things. It might be a policy change. It might be something as small as a policy change to something as big as strategic planning. Every decision you make in an organization sends a message. It could be something really small, like the dress code, you know, and something comes down, and all of a sudden, boom, it's on people's desks, and something is different, and no one knows why. No one knows who made it. No one knows how it's going to be enforced or why that is. So that's a small example, but it sends a huge message. It says a message of exclusion. The other thing that happens about when you include people, and this is also another idea that I'm really excited about, is that when people are included, it's just a natural outcome that they're going to feel like they have more personal meaning from their work. You know, they get up in the morning and they have something to go to that really inspires them. I don't think you really have that problem. I think your people are really inspired, but this is a way to generate even more personal meaning. or if you have groups of stakeholders who maybe aren't as engaged as you would like, I would look at ways that maybe they have thought about feeling included or not included. So what's the easiest way in your minds of how to know if someone feels included or not? Yes, you ask them. You ask them. This is a business of asking people where they are and how they are with things. That's what works with these teams. And this Fortune 100 company that I was alluding to earlier, I'll finish that story. You know, they were a great group, a young group, an IT group going through lots of changes. And we do feedback assessments. We ask them at the end and also several times during the day, you know, if their needs are being met, what they'd like to have different. We call them pluses and deltas. That comes from a process called Six Sigma, which a lot of companies use to improve quality process and delivery. But this is a very important concept, is every meeting, every conversation, you can end it by saying, how was that for you? What did you like? What would you have liked to have been different? It's such a simple thing. But we often don't pause to stop and ask people. And earlier I was talking to Donna, who's your executive director, president, executive director. And I was telling her, and I mentioned to this yesterday too, your passion for what you do actually puts you at a slight disadvantage. And here's why. People who are passionate have a message that they really want people to get. And it might make you slightly less inclined to hear what the other person has to say, particularly when it's not in alignment with your message. It's just something that I find in groups that are very passionate that you might want to be aware of. So group productivity, inclusion, personal meaning. So why are we like this? If we were born to partner, why do we have conflict in organizations? Why does it get complicated? Well, the reason is very simple, and it's something we might not think about. For about 3,000 years, we've been living in what some people call a domination hierarchy. And what basically that is that a very few people have controlled the vast majority of resources and decision making for most of us. Even though we live in a great country with a democracy that we have, very few people control the vast majority of resources and decision makings. I don't know if you've noticed this. Statistics come out about, have you seen those statistics that about 1% of the wealthiest US Americans control more than half of the net worth in this country? Have you seen that? It's shocking. It's not our fault that we live in this kind of system, but it is a system of exclusion. It's the opposite of what we've been talking about. This system also has three main motivators on how to motivate people to do something, and these are what they are. It's fear, guilt, and shame. Okay? If you look at a lot of organizations, whether it's intentional or inadvertent, and I being, the person who wrote the book, The Empathy Factor, I tend to think that it's mostly inadvertent. It's sort of a function of habit. Okay, so we're like fish in water. We live in this habit of being in these organizations. And I'll give you a small example of inadvertent fear. These companies I work with that have 80,000 employees, so they're going to go through a downsizing. People know it's coming. Okay? So you can't eliminate fear altogether. It's a part of the natural condition. To be clear, I'm not saying it's our job to eliminate fear. I'm just saying as often as possible, can we eliminate it by putting ourselves in the shoes of people who will be receiving the message. In the case of these large companies doing downsizing, one of the main things that contributes to people's fear is they don't know what criteria people are using. They have no idea how the separations will be decided, when they will be coming. So when we work with these managers, we don't say, don't let people go. It might be a need, a business decision based on resources available, based on changing market conditions. But what we do say is be very clear about when you're going to do it. Do what you say you're going to do. Tell people right away. Tell them straight up and honestly. And tell them why they were selected and why others are not. That one factor alone reduces a significant amount of fear among people. Transparency, we call this in my business the quality of transparency, is one of the fastest ways you can reduce fear, to just be transparent. I work with a lot of leaders and CEOs, and sometimes, and we train them, we teach them to even go to a meeting and say, you know, I don't have the answers today, but here's what I can tell you. Just to be honest. People really appreciate this. And this is something we're not taught to do. Why? Because of this third point, shame. So shame is something that happens in organizations when there's some sense that you're going to be separated from other people. So again, here's a simple idea. You have some feedback for someone. It could be very small. You'd like them to do something differently. I always encourage people to do it in private. It might be really small. It might be so much easier for me to just tell you, hey, by the way, do this or do that a little differently, and it just happens to be at the end of the meeting. But it goes a long way for that other person to be able to hear it in a private one-on-one conversation. Because you don't know what the history of people are. We don't know when we work with people in the workplace what kind of family they grew up in, how they were treated when they were younger. And people come with their own histories. And if you speak to them in a way that just happens to activate that trigger, what we call triggers, you won't really know it. And they may never say anything to you, but now you've created a separation in them and they'll be demotivated. I was working with a nonprofit group and I went in to do some early interviews, and they had just hired a manager, a new manager, a program manager. And I was talking to him and I said, how is it going? And he said, it's going great, I love being here, except we have a problem. 2 weeks he was there and I was talking to him. And I said, what's the problem? He said, well, I come in the morning at 8 o'clock, right on time, I'm ready to start working. And then the executive director, she comes barreling in, she never says good morning, and she starts talking about work. And I said, so what's that like for you? And he said, well, it's, you know, I think it's very rude and disrespectful. So I said, okay. I asked him, have you asked her to say good morning to you? Have you told her, you know, how important that is, how you'd like that? And this was interesting to me. He said, no, she should know better. So what's the chances? So then I go and talk to the executive director. The interviews are confidential, so now I'm over here talking to her. I'm not going to mention what he said because it's, you know, anonymous and confidential. But I find out from her that she comes in at 6 in the morning, 5:30 in the morning sometimes. By the time her staff gets there at 8, it's almost lunchtime for her. So now we see, you know, the other side. So she forgets to say good morning. So I go back to the other person. You know, I talk a little bit more to him, and I ask him, are you willing, you know, to ask her? I tell him, I'm worried for you. This is something that's important to you. It happens every day, first thing in the morning. And he says, no, you know, she should know better. I don't want to ask her. I say, okay. So how long do you think, so now I'm thinking, right, he's going to be here for maybe 3 weeks, maybe a month. And this is the kind of stuff that happens because we get disconnected over very simple things. Guilt is another piece, like fear, where people tend to maybe take something on. And I read a great article from the former CEO of Travelocity. And I can't remember her name right now, but she was the CEO there. She's now at American Express. And they had a whole division that they started that really flopped. I mean, it was, you know, they put a ton of money into it and it didn't work. They didn't get the return on investment. Things weren't happening the way they were expecting. And she said in this interview, I was really struck by it, and she was a young CEO, about 30 years old at the time. She said, we went out of our way to make sure that the people in that division knew what we got out of what they did with that operation, and that it wasn't a failure. We learned a lot of lessons. She said, we went out of our way to let people know that what they did really mattered and we learned something from it, that it was still valuable. So fear, guilt, and shame is the old way. So I want to talk to you just briefly about this model that's on the screen now. I drew something similar, a hand drawing of this, when I was meeting with a nonprofit group over the phone last fall. In the middle, you see this piece. I call it the sandwich model because the middle is kind of like the meat, or for those of us who are vegan and vegetarian, you know, the tofu patty. So that's the relationship part. The thing that's very complicated about organizations, and I'm very passionate about this piece, so I hope I can communicate this to you. When there's interpersonal conflicts in organizations, they tend to be symptoms of something else. They are usually not the cause. About 80% or so, you know, that's kind of my guesstimate, and I've heard other great theorists talk about this, about the vast majority of interpersonal conflicts in organizations like yours are not interpersonal issues. What a surprise. The reason is because they are informed primarily by what is the bread on the right-hand side, the organizational piece, the our work. And that organizational piece is really about shared purpose and goals. So for example, we know that this is true because if you take people who get along really well and you put them into a system that creates competition for resources, information, and pits them against each other, guess what will happen? These friends will become not so good friends. So when I go into an organization and I see there's interpersonal conflict, I never work on that conflict first. I instead do an assessment of the leadership to understand what are the systems of authority and accountability that are set up. How is the compensation structured? What are the ways that decision making happens in the group? I look at all the things that kind of belong to the system first. The other thing I want to caution you about is if two people, or sometimes right now we're working on something where I have two divisions, departments, an IT department and a sales department that are really butting heads. When these two groups or people are having a conflict and you bring in someone to mediate that conflict, or someone like me who says, okay, here's a conflict, now I'm going to all bring you in the room and I'm going to fix that conflict. What I've actually done is I've contributed more to the problem. So kind of a surprising thing. The reason is because I've now validated this idea that the problem is the people, and I haven't even touched the system. So this is one of the reasons why people like me go into organizations, is because with our training, we look for things like this, what we call our work, the organizational work. On the left-hand side is what is called my work. It's the intrapersonal piece. And this is a really key component of nonviolent communication. In every moment, like right now, you are thinking certain things. And those thoughts are invisible to anyone else but yourself. Sometimes I call it the stories we tell ourselves. These stories are completely coloring your perception of reality at this time. But we don't think about that. We think the reality is that person out there. We think the reality is what happened and what we're seeing out in our environment. The truth is that what colors our reality is our own thinking and our own history. So I just share that with you in passing because I feel passionately about that. This is another way to look at this piece. It's all three of these nested together. I call it intrapersonal, what goes on inside of us. Interpersonal is the next ring, what goes on between us. And organizational, which is what goes on in our whole system. This is a very complicated way that organizations work. So I want to relieve you of any pressure that you feel that you think you should know how to do this, or that you're supposed to be really good at making partnerships and teamwork work, or that it should be easy. Because it's very complicated in organizations. So what's the solution? Well, the solution, I think, is empathy. And empathy, in the way I describe it, I will cover on the next slide. Empathy is what I call a trim tab factor. Buckminster Fuller, who is a great modern philosopher and thinker, talked about a trim tab factor. How many of you have heard about the trim tab factor? Okay, so several of you, not many. So the trim tab is a piece of it's a small rudder that's attached to the big rudder of an ocean liner. When the ocean liner is moving, the big rudder has so much water pressure on it. It's this big flat plane. And if you try to turn the rudder, it's very hard. It moves very slowly. So you can think of the ocean liner as your organization and the rudder as maybe some decisions to turn it. It's very hard to turn it. And in fact, if you turn it too hard, it breaks. So nautical engineers discovered that if they put this little tiny rudder that's very small in comparison to the big rudder on the trailing end of the rudder, the big rudder, and if you turn that, it's easy to turn, it's small, it breaks the whole plane of resistance for the big rudder, and then the big rudder turns very quickly. And this is why I'm excited about empathy as a workplace skill and tool for groups and teams, because I believe it is the trim tab for making things work in the way we want them in organizations, increasing group productivity and also generating more personal meaning for yourself. Empathy, in the research that we've done that's included in the book, leads to two major things. There's two major tracks. The first track is increased trust. You can't buy trust. Trust is hard won and hard earned. And empathy is a very fast way to develop trust. The other piece is engagement. People get very engaged because they feel part of something. People want to get up in the morning and belong to something. So this is what happens, and it leads to increased profit, productivity, and meaning. This is what's in the organizational research and what's my experience as well. So there is a hole in the research, and the research is that no one really says how to do empathy. So how do you do empathy? Some people say you put yourself in other people's shoes, but what if you're not very imaginative? This becomes a problem. So this is where these two processes, nonviolent communication developed by Marshall Rosenberg, and integrated clarity, which is the piece that I added. So nonviolent communication, or NVC for short, is primarily an interpersonal process. It's about what goes on between two people or also within ourselves. But it doesn't really address this idea of what happens when you bring it into the larger scope of organizations. So that's the piece I added called integrated clarity. And integrated clarity is really about this idea of organizations, a collective group of people having shared needs and shared goals together. Shared statement of principles was something I heard a group talk about yesterday. So this is what that piece is about. So I'm going to give you kind of a quick primer on NVC. Okay, so this is the fun part, because what really creates empathy is some fluency of feelings of people. So this is a topic that gets a lot of controversy. I met with a group in a social services environment once. They're in the business of helping people. And we were talking about feelings, and the executive director raised her hand and she said, "I don't want to talk about feelings because it's not appropriate for work." So she's a social services director. She doesn't want to talk about work, she doesn't want to talk about feelings. And this to me is the fundamental principle. So here's what I have to say about feelings. Every moment that we're alive and conscious, we are having feelings. Feelings are not things in our heads, they're felt sensations in our bodies. So right now even, if you do just a scan, you're feeling something. Hopefully you're inspired, excited. Maybe you're figuring out some other things. But this is what's going on. Feelings are stuff that's going on. The only time we don't have them is when we're dead or unconscious. That's just part of being a human being. When I talk about feelings in workplaces, I'm not talking about what you may consider, or some people consider, inappropriate expression of feelings. Okay. Feelings, workplaces and teams are not the place to go do your therapy, okay, or get counseling. Okay. It's a place where stuff just comes up and we can address it. There's a difference between being aware of feelings and the expression of feelings. Sometimes I'm always surprised, a little bit about how there's a couple feelings that I find are legitimate in organizations. I sometimes work with organizations where it's okay in a way for people to be angry. Where someone might have an expression of anger, or where people are talking among themselves and anger is kind of a part of the fabric because of the frustration they might have. So there's a difference to me in being aware of feelings and the expression of feelings. In this model, we're talking about just being aware of them. Feelings are not the main goal of this process. The goal of this process is what's called universal needs. Feelings happen to be the most readily accessible data that points us to whether our needs are met or unmet. That's as simple as it gets. So when we call it universal needs, what NVC means by this is the kinds of needs that we all share in common. They're not desires, wishes, or strategies. They're not particular to a specific person or a specific request. These are just universal needs like respect, love, understanding. When I first heard this concept, it sounded so simple. I kind of didn't believe how powerful it could be. And then something happened to me. I was in a parking lot. Driving, I was pulling out of a parking lot in a shopping center. And you know how and there was a baby stroller here and some people walking, and you know how sometimes you have to pull out and you're kind of in the wrong lane, the oncoming lane, until you can wind back to the other side. And so when I pulled out, I just happened for 2 seconds to be in the lane of the oncoming traffic. And this big SUV came around much faster than I wanted. And all of a sudden, we were like this, and her windows are up, but I can see her doing, screaming at me, through the window. And I get into my lane and, I drive off. And for 5 minutes, I felt really a lot of unpleasant feelings in my body. I thought, she doesn't understand. This is my own thinking, right? I'm telling myself I had a perfectly legitimate reason about why I was in the wrong lane, because there was a baby stroller. I'm a good person. I was trying to do a good thing. I even thought, about a mile up the road of turning around and, finding this person and going back to explain to her about why I was in the wrong lane. And then I even thought I could go into the stores nearby to get witnesses to also talk to her to explain why I was in the wrong lane so that she could understand. So, at some point I didn't turn around and I realized that this was absurd. Because here was a woman who I would never see again, who meant nothing to me in terms of a relationship because I had none with her. And this whole event took probably 15 seconds. So now my question for me is, using this process, what was I feeling? I was feeling really frustrated. And what need of mine might have been unmet? I had a need for understanding. So now I can ask myself, wow, you have such a huge need for understanding. It can't possibly be related to this event. What is it related to? So I started asking myself this, and the answer I came up with was about my work. This work that I do was so important to me, and it was not yet published in the Change Handbook, which is the first time it was published. So it was just kind of all in my head and on, within our own office and not really out to other people. And I realized that my need for understanding was really about my work and what I wanted to contribute to people out of my own desire to help ease a lot of discomfort and tension that I see on work teams. So I then was able to make requests of myself. Having connected with these feelings and needs, I was able to make a request of myself. And what happened? I ended up writing this book that's now published to meet my need for understanding about my work. Publishing this book has changed my life because now I'm able to connect with you without me being there. You can buy the book and I'm there somehow with you. And my need for understanding is met. So you see, that's a tiny little event. I could have written it off and I could have missed such a huge opportunity to get connected to something that was important to me. So here's a clue. When you are stimulated, when you're aroused in a big way over a relatively small event, it's a clue. And if you want a list of feelings and needs, they're available at no charge. You can download them for free from our website. And there's a whole list of feelings and needs. And I tell you this, and there's some chuckling because we're not trained. How many of you have had a course in understanding your feelings and needs? Okay, so maybe not any of you. But we're not educated in how to do this. We're not habituated to self-connect. So I worked with a healthcare system once, and a nurse looked at this list of needs, and she said, oh my gosh, I have this need, and that need, and that need, and tears coming down her face because she had never before, she wasn't even able to name her own needs. It's a very powerful process. And if you have a chance to do that, even if it's just for fun, I encourage you to do that. So earlier I talked about how empathy is a two-way street. This is one of the common misunderstandings about empathy. Yes, it is about empathic listening. It is about listening to what other people have to say and connecting with their feelings and needs. So I've introduced this concept to you about feelings and needs. The process of empathy is very simple, and this is what it is. You guess at what someone else is feeling and what needs of theirs might be met or unmet in the moment. That's it. I was talking to someone earlier and he said, I notice that my listening skills aren't so good. I hope in your talk today you can help me understand how I can be a better listener, because I notice I'm usually waiting to talk and respond rather than really listening fully to what the other person says. And I told you, but I promised I wouldn't call on him. They made me promise that. I said, I could give you something, and this is what it is. So while you're listening to someone, if you can just guess what are they feeling and what need might be met or unmet as they're speaking, just silently to yourself. This is not even out loud yet. If you want to do it out loud, I suggest you read the book and maybe have a little bit more training. Because there's a very particular way that can happen. But you can do it just silently to yourself. Let's say you're having a conversation with a difficult, let's say you're having a conversation that you find difficult with someone. You can just start guessing, what is this person feeling? What need might he or she have? It's a very powerful thing, and something starts to happen when you do this. It's an amazing thing. Today, if you just have a chance to do it with one or two people and you want to play with it, there's no right or wrong way. You're doing it just internally. See what happens in the conversation. I think you might be surprised. So empathy is definitely empathic listening to someone else. It is also, as importantly, the honest expression of what matters to you. This idea I don't hear very often. Usually we think about empathy as I'm listening to you, I'm listening to you, I'm listening to you. Empathy is also about me honestly expressing to you what's important to me and what matters to me, having heard what you said. Empathy is not something you give to someone else or you get from someone else. It's the space that happens between two people when this process is going on, when we're both listening empathically and expressing honestly. So what's a way to express? Well, you might want to let people know what you're feeling and what needs are being met or not met. So for example, you might be in a conversation, and it takes also, you can do this process in 40 words or less. It's also very efficient. When we teach it to work teams, they use it as a way to create efficiency. So you see something. So we've talked about connecting to feelings and needs. You see something, you make an observation. There's two more parts to this model, but I'm not going to get into that in depth. But you see or hear something, there's an observation. And now you want to express yourself. The way that I find it's very efficient is to say something like, seeing what results we got from this project, I'm feeling very discouraged because, I have a need for more progress. You would be amazed just in those few words how clearly people understand what you're saying. And sometimes people skip the feelings. If you're not comfortable with feelings, saying it out loud, then skip it. And just use it as a way to connect with your own needs. If you can tell people what needs of yours are being met or unmet, you'll have greater solutions to problems, greater productivity. The last piece that happens when this kind of connection occurs is you're able to make requests. This is why I believe this process of connecting to feelings and needs is so powerful for business, for workplaces, is because it leads to very specific requests to address solutions and things that are happening. Making requests is a lost art. How to ask for something that's meaningful to you. The reason is because we've grown up in these systems of exclusions, many people hear requests as demands. So that's just kind of what happens as human beings. If you've raised children, if you've parented, you know that the way you get them to brush their teeth is you tell them they don't have to brush their teeth. Right? You tell them the opposite thing, because the moment you tell a child something, they want to do the opposite. Why? Because one of the most powerful needs humans have is the need for autonomy, the need for choice. We want to have choice. So when we make a request, if the request is preceded by how you feel and what need you're trying to meet, you will greatly increase the likelihood that that request will be heard as a request and not as a demand. Greatly increase it. So, I have a few things you can do right away as practical tips. One is you can begin with self-empathy. And I can't emphasize this enough. This process is really about getting to know yourself. Self-empathy. What is going on? What story am I telling myself? What am I feeling and what needs of mine are being met or unmet? If you just practice this for a little while, sometimes we have clients that on the hour they do this, or when they eat a meal, or when they drink water, they just check in. What am I feeling and needing? It's not something that most of us have been trained to do. You'd be amazed at how much more clear you get, how much stress can be relieved. When we do this work with work teams, a lot of managers tell us that they have a very felt sense of decreased stress because they're just doing self-empathy. They're doing it with themselves. They're understanding themselves better. With others, this is something we do in a lot of our contracts that we work with people. As I said earlier, you might have a slight disadvantage because you're passionate about what you do. People who are passionate about what they do tend to want to explain, justify, and defend the stuff that really matters to you. So the tip here is to empathize first and only explain, defend, and justify after you have some sense that that person feels understood, is thinking that they're understood. I can tell you a secret about one thing to look for when people are feeling understood. So let's say you're listening to someone and you keep empathizing with them. You might silently keep guessing what they're feeling and needing, or you might also do this third piece, which is recapping what they're saying. This is also very helpful, to just repeat and recap what they've said. So one of the ways you can know that someone is thinking that they're heard is they actually stop talking. It might be for just 2 or 3 seconds, but they'll be going, saying something, saying something, saying something. You might recap. You might guess their feelings and need. They say more, they say more, they say more. And then all of a sudden, there's a place where they just stop. And that's when you know it might be a good time for you now to honestly express what you're thinking and feeling based on what you just heard them say. When you do it beforehand, before they're ready, people don't have the capacity to hear. So waiting until they're ready is a sign. The third piece is recapping others in your own words, simply to repeat back. So someone says to you, This is a really terrific program because so many of us are enjoying this class. And you say, this is a really terrific program. So many of you are enjoying this class. It's so simple. And yet, people get very excited because they felt heard. There are not very many places in work or in society where people feel heard. If you can give that to people, and it takes 3 seconds to recap, if you can give that to people and even play with that today in your networking and your conversations, I'm guessing you're going to see something exciting happen. That's my guess. So this is feelings and needs of people. And then there's this piece about the organizations, and then I'm going to wrap up and take some questions. We didn't have time to cover this in depth today because of our short time together, but all of this is in the book, and some of it is on our website. But this is what I want to share with you. If there's the piece that really helps organizations decrease conflict, increase productivity, and also increase personal meaning and morale, is when an organization is very clear about at least these 3 things. Identity, who are you collectively? What are your values? What do you believe in? What are you passionate about? These are some of the questions. And also, what can you be the very best at? When we support groups in thinking about their future, we're very interested in supporting them in doing what they can be the very best at, in addition to their passion. If you try to, I see a lot of nonprofits branch into other areas, maybe develop programs because there's a grant available for it and it's not really something that's your strength. That, I think, is a mistake. It doesn't matter where the money is, you have to go where your heart is and what you're naturally inclined to be very good at. Organizations are like people, they're very unique. There's certain things you're good at that I'm not good at, and vice versa. Same thing with organizations. Do what is very natural for you to be excellent at. Don't go where the money is, because you'll find yourself getting very dispersed. We work with a lot of nonprofits that, in what I call, chase grants, and they end up getting very diffused and pretty soon confused. So this is a big piece here. As far as direction is concerned, this is maybe the one most powerful thing you can do. People like to work within a certain time frame of a mission. Have something that begins and ends, a campaign that begins and ends. It has a start date and an end date, and some way of measuring it that is completely transparent to everybody. Some of the old nonprofit groups used to have the big thermometer, that was the goal, right? And you'd see the money rising with the thermometer. It sounds, maybe a little goofy, but it works. We call it a dashboard. You drive a car, you know where you're going, what speed you're at. So what's the dashboard for your organization? What's the dashboard for your program? Can everybody see it? That's one of the key pieces. And have a beginning and an end. I can walk into an organization and pretty much tell if they're on a campaign or not. Organizations and workplaces where there's a campaign, there's this energy of, wow, we're going to get stuff done. We really want to come alive and get something done together. We know where we are in relationship to the goals. We've got to get this done by the end of the month, the end of this week. Have something that works, that everyone can see. Transparency, again, is the key. There's some other needs here that I won't go into detail about, but I just wanted to touch on structure a little bit. And this is something really important. The first law of biomechanics is that structure governs function. Structure governs function. If you create a structure, a particular way that people talk together, a particular reporting structure, it will inform who the organization becomes. And it will happen unconsciously. So look at how your governance structures work. Look at how your reporting structures work. Who reports to whom? Our advice to you, my suggestion to you is don't Develop structure before you develop these things: identity, life-affirming purpose, and direction. That's why when you look at maybe some unusual companies, high-tech companies are a perfect example. They have very unusual structures. They might have people who never come to the office at all. Or you look at something like Virgin Airlines, where all their reservation people work at home. There's no office. It's a very unusual structure. Why? Because it grew out of their identity, life-affirming purpose, and their direction. They didn't say we're going to develop, a reservation center and then do these things. That would have been structure before what we call source needs. So self-awareness is the key. Self-awareness of what is going on inside of you, connecting to your own feelings and needs. The very next things you tell yourself, the very next story you tell yourself can change your life. It's amazing. It's powerful. This is also about self-awareness of your whole group. How are you all together? What are the ways you become aware of what your team does, what your group does? And I'll end by saying something about power and leadership. Formal power is something that you have because you have authority over resources, budgets, information. Many people, most people, because most of us still work in a hierarchy. Most of us still work in a place where someone has more authority than we do. It's not good or bad, it's just the way it is. So how can you become a leader in an environment like that? The less structural power you have, the more skill you need with the power of your heart. That's how informal leaders are born. And if you look at organizations, we work with a lot of teams where the person who has the most structural power is not the leader. The leader is somebody who practices empathy. The leader is someone who's a terrific listener and can connect with what matters to the people around them. They're the person that everyone goes to. Do you have somebody like that in your organization? Somebody that everybody wants to talk to them. They want to see what this person thinks. That is really what leadership is about. If you're discouraged because you might not have formal power, I want to encourage you, because you can claim your own power by connecting to your own feelings and needs and the feelings of need and needs of those around you, especially someone who might have formal power. What matters to that person? How can you support that person in meeting his or her own needs? Where are you the same? Where can you become one instead of maybe adversarial? So this is what leadership really is. Leadership, for me, has nothing to do with formal power. Everyone has a right to power and leadership in an organization. So this is the piece that I want to summarize. Empathy leads to inclusion. It's all about needs awareness. And power and leadership can belong to all of us if we claim it by connecting to our feelings and needs. I'll leave you with this last piece. It's not about progress. It's not about perfection, rather. It's about progress. So when I started this, I bumbled around all over the place. The first time I started connecting to someone's feelings and needs was the cab driver taking me to the airport after I had been in a training for this for the first time. And we talked and talked. He said about 400 or 500 words, I don't know, for 45 minutes or so. I said about 30 words, and at the end he turned to me and he said, "That's the best conversation I ever had." So this is what I have for you. I hope it's been of some value for you, and thank you for listening to me.